All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. So we have some interesting stories about Lot and Abraham, and continuing on from where we jumped off last time. Last time we looked into the beginning of the call of Abraham and their adventure or misadventure in Egypt. If you remember the story of Sarah being passed off as Abram's wife, and then
Sister.
or sister, yeah, Abram's sister, getting mixed up with the Pharaoh. There being this whole situation, and they are in the process of moving out of Egypt. So that's where we left off. And now we come to them going into kind of more the area that we kind of associate with Abram and the Hebrew people. I am going to really quickly just share my screen. Give me just a moment to set it up, because I'm going to orient us once again, just so we know what we're looking at. So if you remember, we start the story over here. Oh, wait, not Persia, over here. We go up and around the Levant, because that's the Fertile Crescent, which is green. They have already come down through the this narrow strip of land and gone to Egypt. Since we're no longer, or since Pharaoh said leave Egypt, they don't keep going along the African coast. They kind of turn around and head back up. This little region here is the Negev Desert, which is what's mentioned at the very beginning. To give you all a look, this is what it looks like today.
Ooh.
As you can kind of see, there is a water source here, and there is plant life just around it. But otherwise, this is kind of desert of desert look. And just for a closer zoom in, this is kind of the path once again we're talking about. So they have already traveled this path down, and now they're traveling back up. So to give us a little bit more of our bearings compared to some of our other Bible studies that we talked about, Galilee's up here. So this is the Sea of Galilee. Around here is the Dead Sea. When it talks about the Jordan Valley, it's talking about this area between the two seas, because this area is a lot greener. It has the water from the river itself. Once you get down here, it's really salty because of the Dead Sea, because there's no outlet. The water goes here and it kind of stops. So that will come into play when we talk about Sodom and Gomorrah. There's a thought that those cities are more down here. We don't actually know their location. There's a lot of estimations, but because there's this whole thing with salt, they think it's more around the Dead Sea region. But a lot of our story today is going to take place in like this general area. Do I have one more picture? Oh, that's not a helpful one. Anyways, so with that, to literally guide our mental image and give us bearing to the stories, I'm curious of your all's first impression of the stories of Lot and Abraham, as they're kind of up to, so I mean, this is more like family stories. It's less family stories or political stories, kingly stories. It's not as much talk about God, but you do get to see a little bit about the dynamics of family and politics. So I'm curious what you all think.
Well, I didn't know how many chapters to read, so I kept reading, but it seemed repetitious, and they were really human. What were we supposed to read as far as the part about Sarah, or not?
So I was planning
Because
on doing.
They treated people badly. I mean,
we'll hold off talking about Sarah and kind of some of those things.
How far did we go in our reading?
We'll focus on 13 and 14 for today.
Oh, okay.
So mostly, okay. I wanted to keep the two stories of Lot and Abraham together, or at least these first stories of Lot and Abraham.
He was very protective of Lot, and he was willing to do anything to take. Then he would get into Sodom and Gomorrah then, right? Yeah. Because, okay. Okay, we don't get to the part where I seem to be telling the same story over and over with a slightly different twist.
We'll get to the repetitious nature. So any other thoughts on this, on the
Okay.
initial stories here?
It was sort of hard to grasp the significance of them. I
Mhm.
mean,
Yeah, it doesn't seem to have as much like takeaway meaning. It's not
yeah,
like
yeah. Other than the thing that strikes me is this meticulous attention to detail. You know, poor Lot gets captured, so Abram's got to go rescue him. So he takes 312 men
Yeah.
with him, you know, to go, and he manages to free Lot, you know, and get him back, you know. But just this, again, this sort of obsession with, you know, how many soldiers went with Abram to rescue Lot, you know, what's, you know, well, that's interesting, but so what?
Yeah, well, I think it's supposed to show that Lot was really important to him.
Right.
mhm.
Yeah, and the family loyalty was very important. This wasn't when, and then is this the part where they, he doesn't want, there's this whole thing about not taking anything from the defeated people. The
Mhm.
defeated tribe wants to give him all sorts of stuff, and he says he won't take it. There's apparently some kind of law that says you're not supposed to do that, and he doesn't want to. And I've forgotten what happens, but
Yeah,
oh,
so
it-
that's
yeah.
at the end where you have this politics of gifting.
yeah, I don't know what that's about.
Okay.
What they're trying to demonstrate there, but after he defeats them, he treats them kindly.
Mhm.
But that's not true other places, but it's certainly in this case he did.
All right. All right. Any other initial thoughts, or we'll dive into the beginning and kind of work our way through to the gifts?
Okay.
All right. So let's go ahead and dive in. So one of the initial problems that sets up this whole scenario is kind of a butting heads, not of Abram and Lot, but the herdsmen of Abram and Lot, which is interesting. Like last time we discussed a little bit of like, how big is the company of Abram? Like how many people? And I feel like we get some answers this time around. I didn't read ahead last time, or else I would have pointed us forward. So it's enough that evidently we have in verse 6 that the land could not support both of them living together, which basically means there's not enough food for the livestock. And Abram's evidently rich enough, he has gold and silver, but it doesn't seem to be an interpersonal issue between Abram and Lot, but the people underneath them.
Yeah.
So the solution is to go different ways. And I want to actually dwell on this because it seems like, I mean, pretty matter of fact. Like this isn't stories that like, I mean, kind of like Larry, you're pointing out, it just kind of is like telling it like it is, and here's the dynamic. But it's interesting thinking a little bit about the dynamic between two family members. And granted, Lot's basically the only family that Abram has, and we see the tenderness and the willingness to go get him later, but they're in a situation where it's not good to live next to each other or to be in the same area. And I'm curious if you've seen kind of this dynamic at all in play in your families or friends, where it's not that there's necessarily an interpersonal problem, but there's a functional problem that kind of leads to interpersonal solutions.
Lloyd Carr's grandson's going to go be quarterback at Notre Dame. He's not going to Michigan. He's not staying with the family.
Oh.
Going out on his own.
Oh.
And that's causing all sorts of consternation amongst at least the sports writers
In the paper.
in the paper. Yeah.
I know about that.
Oh, you know, that's an interesting way to look at it. Or like, how many times do we move because of jobs or school or whatnot, and kind of like
Yeah.
leave the security of family networks?
Mhm.
Yeah. That's one I've actually been thinking about in the church world, because I mean, in the many varied ways of questioning, why aren't there young people in the church? And it's something we see at Northminster is people have left because of jobs. And it's not like they've joined other churches. They still see Northminster as a home, but they're not here. They're not present.
Yeah.
And
But even in this story, nothing is said about, well, how did Lot feel about this? And how did Abram? You know, it's just sort of, they decided, well, we can't both stay here, so you go this way and I'll go that way. And that's it.
But it was friendly, it wasn't.
Yeah.
yeah. Mary Ellen, did you have a thought?
Gonna say the same thing Sue did, that it was friendly, and Lot doesn't seem to have any resentment about being told to go find his own place. And that kind of amazed me, because, you know, I would have the reaction of, why am I being sent away? Or, you know, can't we find a way to make this work? Or, but Lot just accepted it. Didn't have any resentment. Thought that was interesting.
Do we really know that? It says nothing about how they felt about it.
No,
Other than Abram says, if you choose to go that way, I'll go the other way. So he's sort of giving Lot almost maybe first choice, if not, you know. But nothing is said about how they felt about it.
it seems like they just accepted.
Well, he
So-
does let there be no strife.
I mean, no reaction is not an indication that nothing happened.
Lot might have been resentful. We
Yeah.
don't know.
We
So
don't know.
Here is actually an interesting feature that you find in scripture, is that the important details of the story and what's considered essential has changed dramatically. Most of these stories, there's not, I mean, sometimes there's emotion, but there is kind of this void where they like tell what happened, and what happened is more important than how people felt. And the interesting way that you can use this if you're intentional about it. So this is one where I say, do it, but know you're doing it, is sometimes this works like a mirror, and we can like see something like this and we imagine what our emotion is, but that actually tells us something about our own story rather than the story here. That if you're reading this and you're like, the thought is like, wow, like they separated and they seem to be on good terms. There didn't seem to be a kerfluffle over it. Either that's amazing or that's cool to see. Like, what does that say about how does that reaction reflect on us versus reading and going, wow, I wonder if Lot was resentful, and how that reflects in our own story. That there's this cool thing where scripture can kind of be a mirror where we can almost pay attention to our own reaction and see where we are filling in our emotions, because they don't give it. So we don't know, but it's partly because it wasn't as important to them.
What we do,
So we're okay with it, huh? Mary Ellen, I'm sorry.
do know is that Abram did everything he could to make it easy for Lot, where Lot would have the first choice, that Abram would accommodate himself to whatever choices Lot made. And I find that remarkable.
Yeah.
Of course, look what Lot got. He got Sodom and Gomorrah, and that didn't turn out so great either. So,
They didn't know that then.
So yeah, you have this cool dynamic of like, my personal thing is I almost see Abram as more like a mentor figure here, where it's like, okay, you're ready, go fly, buddy. Like you're ready to like run your own business. You're ready to go out on your own. You get a choice. I'm stable enough. I have enough like going on here that like I can make do with the second grade land. That's okay. You do what will set you up for success. So that's what I'm personally reading into the story of like kind of like Abram going, okay, you choose. But it's also interesting that Lot has to deal with his choice. So it's almost careful what you choose from. So we have that like image of the Negev and kind of the deserty area. And that's actually the direction, or that's more of the terrain that Abram goes into, and Lot goes into more of the valley region that's watered by the river, and so theoretically would be an easier time. So what do we think about this? So going into more of the choice dynamic that, yeah, Lot got to choose, and the shiny option the better looking option didn't exactly pan out. What do we think of that?
It's life. We go through that all the time.
Say more about it.
Say what?
I said, say more. Is there like an example you have in mind of something you thought was going to be excellent and turned out not to be?
And then divorce. They thought they chose the best, and having a very bright and happy future ahead of them, and then it all falls apart. It happens in life all the time.
Sure.
Yeah.
Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be hard when you think you're like, you see the advice of people and you think you're following people's advice, like, okay, this will set me up for a good situation. I'll go to the good college. I've met someone nice, and you do the things, but it's never a guarantee that it actually works.
Especially if you go to a certain college because your boyfriend's there.
Right.
That almost never works.
Oh. Right. So we kind of have a little bit of an inkling towards the end of this little section. What verse am I at? Just before verse 11. We have kind of a little foreshadowing. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So the interesting thing about all of this is we have no idea where these two cities were, but they're famous enough that this kind of has to be added in before we're even close to the stories of Sodom and Gomorrah. Like, this is the destruction of these two cities is well known, and it feels almost paradoxical that today we have no idea where they are. Like there's evidence that these aren't like mythological cities, they likely did exist, but we just don't have record of it, of the like actual location. It's weird, isn't it?
Yeah, I didn't know.
They got burned up.
Theoretically, yeah.
Like they dropped an atom bomb on them. They kind of disappeared.
Right. So they go their separate ways, and then we come to verse 14, the end of chapter 13, and we kind of get this reverb of what we talked about in chapter 12. The beginning of chapter 12, we see the call of Abraham. We see God say, go. We're going to give you, what was the wording? I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and I'm going to bless the people you bless and curse the people you curse. You're blessed to be a blessing, all of that. And we get some of this back around. It almost feels like similar ideas, but stated differently. That God pauses Abram after they're separated and says, raise your eyes now to the place where you are now, northwards and southwards, eastwards and westwards. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring can be counted. Rise up and walk the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. And so this is like, once again, God seems to be gifting and showering Abram specifically with additional blessings. This time around, there's nothing on Abram's side other than to like get up and walk around it.
That's something that gets repeated several times, and he keeps saying, but I don't have any offspring.
There's no objection yet, but that is part of it. All right, Mary Ellen.
But weren't there other people already living there? And didn't that create a problem because they felt the land was theirs? Which, has lasted up until today. So, the gift has strings to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that struck me is, when the Lord speaks to Abram, he says, all right, you can look north, south, east, west. He's got three, he's got it all. So Lot's been sort of taken away and put someplace else. And the whole rest of everything now is Abram's. And maybe that was one, somebody had to do something with Lot. So that was a convenient thing to do. Well, let's shuffle him off up the valley to Sodom and Gomorrah, and we'll give the rest of the desert to Abram.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the narrative, yeah, it helps to kind of have Lot off to the side, because there's question of inheritance. And I mean, this is going to definitely come up in a chapter or two of like the problems of inheritance and who does what go to. And there are some who think that Lot could have been the inheritor if Abram didn't have a kid. That is also debated with some of the things that are said about a servant inheriting. It gets complicated. We'll talk about that later. But yeah, it's more helpful to have Lot out of the picture. But there is that fundamental issue that, Mary Ellen, you're 100% right. We are dealing with this today. And the fact of the matter is, the land was never empty. The land had inhabitants, always. And so we have this promise that all of this will be yours. Your descendants will basically be so numerous you can't count them. But this land that belongs to other people, a divine figure is giving to a different person, which means displacement. And so this is part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is it actually does go right back to this, that the Jewish people in some way say like, oh, we go back to Abram and like we were displaced from the land, but it was always ours. And then the other comment is like, but there was always Canaanites, whether they were Palestinians or the people before the Palestinians. It's not like there was an original claim on it. There was always people here. And so there's a question of who does the land actually belong to even today? Which gets messy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, it happens all over the world. I mean, somebody was always there first. In South America and Mexico, they just killed them off with smallpox.
And that's the other unhappy side of this, is this is part of the set of verses that people referenced when they arrived in the Americas.
Right.
The part of like my family that came over with the colonies, they looked and they're like, look, God is giving us this land. Look, it's empty. Excuse me, get out of the way. Look at this empty land. But it wasn't. There was people here. And there's this similar dynamic of. So The other aspect of this that gets interesting actually is we have a little bit of a trail where we see Abram building another altar. There are some other points where Abram returns to altars that supposedly he had built. There's actually, once again, this question of, is it building an altar, appropriating an altar, using an altar? Because there's always a question of whether some of the long-held altars and shrines actually had pagan origins that were just appropriated into the dominant religion. So we see that a little bit at play too here. So any other thoughts before we go into the daring rescue mission? All right, let's carry on. So we start off here in the beginning of 14 with a list of kings, and it kind of reads like the royal annals, doesn't it? It's kind of breaks from this very story-like family storytelling mode. It's not even in the mythological kind of beginnings that we see at the beginning of Genesis. This kind of reads like a court document. And what did you all take from this kind of very courtly, very formal start where these kings are going to war? Did you read it in detail, or did you just kind of like skim over the names and? Okay.
I recognized a couple of names, but they generally, I was surprised that there were so many kings. I mean, were there that many people there?
So here is where this part gets a little weird. There is no record or evidence of any of these people ever existing, or these kingdoms.
Yeah. So it's not just Sodom and Gomorrah they can't find. They can't find Adamah, Zeboim, Bella, any of those places. Is that true?
So this is where, once again, I am relying on the notes because I have a study Bible, and I read all this and went, what in the world is going on here? I am pretty darn sure there's not all these little kingdoms going to war, because like I've seen the maps and I've seen the diagrams, and I feel like I would have noticed if there's a bunch of little kingdoms here. And what at least my notes are talking about is that the names of the countries of the 4 Eastern kings are basically literary inventions and possibly a mixture of real and fictional names. They think that some of this is just pure creative license, because they're, just to go through a few of them, Shinar is kind of a name for Babylonia. Elam is a real place. Elisar is completely unknown. They have no record of this name anywhere else. Goim means nations, and so just one of these kings is named the King of Nations. Amraphel sounds like a Semitic name. Another name looks like a Hurrian name. So this, oh, my dyslexia has hit me with this one. Chedorlaomer is an Edomite name. Tidal looks like a Hittite name. So they're basically using the linguistic flares and kind of trying to find a name that sounds like they're from the different regions. And so they're just meant to be foreign sounding names. They think a lot of these are invented. But that brings up a different question of, if these people are invented, maybe mythologized, maybe more like, I read this more as like King Arthur's legends, where there's probably a dude named King Arthur. He probably had a court, but like all the legends around it we think are pretty inventive from where the truth is. This may be more of like Arthurian legend territory. But the question is, what are they trying to say about Abram? And like the notes are saying like, yes, these are probably fake names, but they're trying to say something about Abram, and these may be a piece of kind of some of the stories that they told. Like this is just like a segment of this grand figure, Abram, that a lot of stories got told about. So what are the different aspects that we're seeing here about this like grand dude Abram and what he's able to do? Are there different aspects or personality traits that we see kind of pieced together in this random story?
Well, the random story ends when they bring Lot into the picture and explained how he lost everything, that all of his goods were taken. That's where it comes back to the storyline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So almost like not like it comes back around to say how like Lot was almost unintentionally disinherited by raiders in war, kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Why were all these kings fighting?
Because kings fight. That's all I can say. That I looked it up because I was thinking this sounded more like chiefdoms or like tribes in conflict.
Mhm.
But the word they
We've heard
use
the
is
word
king.
king
What was that?
before. Were there any other kings? I don't, David was king, but I mean, I'm just thinking about I don't remember the word being used before.
Yeah, this is where we can't verify the history of it.
Okay.
I mean, kind of like Sodom and Gomorrah, we think that there's something, we think these cities exist, we don't know where they are. This is one where it's like, well, there's probably something about this, but there definitely wasn't these small kingdoms banding together.
Yeah,
This may be a part of a different war. I don't like, this is one of those where it looks like historians are like, we don't know what's going on here. It's a story.
yeah, and they say Abram goes up there with 318 men. He rescues Lot and all of his goods
And people.
and people and animals, and there were too many of them to support them along with Abram, and he goes up there with 318 men and brings the whole lot back. I mean, it just it sounds like science fiction.
They're back where they started from.
Well, so here's actually where we do get some questions answered that we were asking before. So we wanted to know how many people are with Abram.
Yeah.
There is 318 fighting men with him.
Yeah.
Which that's a lot. Like he's moving with a small army, theoretically, and those are only the men that are strong enough to fight. There's probably other people along with him. He has a small village, if this is to be trusted. But it kind of gives this depiction of Abram, like the fact that he's able to muscle up that many men and attack like a fully fledged army of kings and win makes him sound like a military genius.
He had enough people that he left behind to care for the cattle, to care for the women that were still in camp. He didn't take his whole
Right.
force wasn't the fighting people. There were all the support people who still were back at camp. So his village, whatever, was enormous.
Yeah. There's a lot of, like, when you start filling in the details, that, yeah, it seems like there's a huge amount of people here.
And yet, throughout the Middle East, they find remnants of places that have maybe a place at this time of in history. And yet here are all those kings up there and all those places that they lived, and nobody knows anything about where any of them are. Now that, again, that just seems like it was, something that might have been invented,
Mhm.
to further the story rather than being based necessarily on a lot of facts.
All of a sudden the mob boss becomes the tribal leader, and the tribal leader becomes the governor, and the governor then becomes the president, and then the president becomes the king. And over the years, it just, the numbers and the details slowly get inflated. But the fact of the matter is, like, it's here, which means it's a popular enough story. They kept telling it. And they seem to want their like main guy that God is giving all these blessings and promises with. They want him to be that like military leader, or a mighty sheik is one of the other descriptions of like a sizable army. Like, Abram's evidently fairly talented, or at least their depiction of him is fairly talented. He's not just like a savvy business dude. He can attack. Oh, look at, I mean, it almost makes me think of when people are like, oh yeah, my dad can beat up your dad. And yeah, some dads can do that. And then some dads are, kids just believe their dad can do that. And so, so this is the story at least that passed around about Abram, but it does seem like the record says that he's able to save Lot. Kind of like the story of Sarah that's going to come back around again. This story's going to come back around again because Lot falls into trouble again. But at least this first time we see the rescue of Lot, at least some of his possession, or it says his possessions, and some of the other things that got taken off as part of this conflict.
Yeah, one of the things I noticed is that earlier on, he had his name changed from Abram to Abraham, and now he's back to Abram again. He goes back and forth because there's in a couple of chapters ahead, when God makes another agreement with him, says you will be now called Abraham, and it's another repetition.
Yeah, we'll get to the name change later. So that when it changes. So right now we're just, I call him Abraham just because I don't know. It's easy. My brain always says Abraham. He's just Abram at this moment.
Yes, but doesn't it say Abraham in the?
No.
Oh, it does say Abram. Okay, I didn't notice.
I think our brains sometimes autofill because we always talk about Abraham. We kind of forget that.
Of course.
So let's talk about the ending, because this is the other thing that kind of sets a few things up. And I want to know if you all think that if this is benevolence or if this is politics at its finest. So Abram returns from this rescue mission, has a bunch of stuff in tow. They're evidently hauling a bunch of livestock with them because they rescued it. And they return to the king. What do we have? The king of Sodom went out to meet him. And the king of, oh, that's an untranslated word. Okay. There's a few kings that come to greet him. They give him this blessing of blessed Abram by the Most High, God maker of heaven and earth. Blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hands. And so then we have this kind of exchange where it says Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. And the king wants to give him back more. And Abram says, no. I've promised to God, I am not taking your stuff. I will not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything, because he doesn't want the king to be able to say, I made Abram rich. And there's this whole dynamic where Abram's like, I'm not touching your stuff, even though the king's trying to be generous and thank him back. So what is your idea of what's going on here? Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, I have to question even the start of this. And the accuracy of what's being reported. Because up
Okay.
in 11, we have the enemy took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all of their provisions and went their way. So now Sodom is barren. And now we get back down here where the king of Sodom is active when his entire community existence had been wiped out in verse 11. And so now we have all of these other kings and whatever, and I'm kind of processing this as I'm talking, but I'm thinking that the story, the accuracy of the story is not there, that the story is being told to teach a lesson or I don't know what I'm trying to say, but I question this because of verse 11. I question the whole rest of what's being told.
That it almost feels like a story to talk about manners rather than, I mean, yeah, because let's see, where is it? Verse 10, the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, and some fell into them and the rest fled into the hill country. So they seem to have scattered. But it seems like by the time Abram returns, it seems more put together again. Is that more or less what you're saying?
The king of Sodom has been victorious. He's won. I mean, it was the enemies that came and sacked Sodom and Gomorrah and took Lot. But the king of Sodom ended up being the victor in the war amongst the kings. And then he goes out, because it says, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet Abram.
Mhm.
Oh,
So King Sodom of Sodom has won the war. And now he's meeting with Abram, who's got Lot and all of his stuff together, and probably maybe a little extra. So Abram gives him 10%, right? 1/10 of everything. And the
like the
king
marshal.
says, just give me the people, but take the goods for yourself. And it's the goods that Abram refuses.
So I'm looking in my notes again to try to piece some of this out, because this does seem to be in conflict. If Sodom was looted, basically, the military hauls it off, and yet at this point in the story, it seems like the enemy was defeated. It
Yeah.
looks like it is because of Abram that Sodom won. More like mercenaries.
Those 312 men, man,
Yeah.
they beat all those armies.
That's where, once again, I mean, it's not unlike the story we tell about the 300 Spartans.
Yeah, but look too at how many different armies were fighting. I mean, that's a list of what, 10, 15 different kings all embroiled in battle, you know. So
Right.
there was some, you know, after the sack of Sodom and Gomorrah, there must have been some rearrangement of forces, and a group of kings became victorious, and the king of Sodom was one of them.
Yeah, so it seems like something's happened off screen with
Yeah.
the militaries at play.
The
Something
war,
happened.
the war ended.
Right.
See,
The war
because-
ends, and here Abram comes back with all their stuff.
Yeah,
That does not mean, though, that the city isn't in disrepair. If your city got
Absolutely.
sacked,
yeah, oh, yeah, yeah.
And so, yeah, the response seemed to be the king of Sodom's like, please don't take my people, but of the stuff, you can take the stuff.
Yeah.
Almost as payment and goodwill.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm. The stuff would be like the sheep and the camels and things like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the gold and the silver.
Oh, okay. Did they, as we were talking about all their livestock and how they had to have a place for them to graze, is that all they ate? I mean, this is sort of beside the point, but did they eat vegetables or grain or what, how did?
Yeah, so there, this is at least what we know today about the relationship that we see between herding societies and agricultural societies is part of the nomadic, and I feel like in our colloquial language makes it sound like they're just aimlessly wandering without a map. Nomadic, in a more based on the nomadic people we know today, they have a route that they just cycle through. It just means that they don't have one base, but there's typically a time of the year that they hit different places, and it often follows the growing season of different areas. And so they would basically trade with agriculturalists as they cycled around. So they brought the meat, and they would trade the meat for more agricultural products. So part of this is actually the dynamic of what was happening in Darfur in the Sudanese conflict a while back, was that there was a lack of water for the herds people and the farmers, and the tensions broke down, and then one side got armed, and then basically the cyclical relationship between the two melted down, even though they had historically traded with each other.
Well, that's true here too. I think there's a lot of, well, historically, a lot of conflict between the people who wanted the land for their animals and the people who wanted to farm.
Yeah.
It's probably worse now.
So, yeah. So let's return to the thing. So why is Abram refusing to take the benefits that the king is offering him? Why say no to the stuff?
Was he just trying to look like a good guy?
He doesn't, Abram's, or the thought at least of some people, God has provided this for Abram. I mean, God has made certain promises to him. And Abram is saying, okay, nobody else is going to be able to lay claim that they, were the ones that made me wealthy, that they were the ones that helped me, and so forth. So to me, that was the reason why he said, okay, I don't want any of your stuff. I'm not taking any of this stuff you got through the wars and so on and so forth. The Lord has promised me what I am going to have.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's seen, in that light, it's seen as like being faithful of, oh, I don't need wealth through ill-begotten means. I am blessed enough. God's going to continue to bless me. I'll be fine. I'm going to trust in God. I don't want to be reliant on kings. The only thing that I would challenge this by is when he left Egypt, he was more than willing to take the Pharaoh stuff.
Maybe it was better stuff.
This is why I think it's actually politics. I mean, there's morality here too. Like, I don't doubt that Abram meant what he said when he's like, I'm relying on God for my wealth. But I wonder if it's a way to instill goodwill if he's going to continue trading with these people.
Well, too, this priest comes out and bless Abram, what sort of indicates, at least he feels, and maybe a lot of other people do too, that in some way Abram was responsible for the good outcome of the war. And bless, the God in heaven, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand, And it sort of sounds as if they're saying, well, Abram must have had something to do with this good outcome of the war.
Yeah. Certainly had something to do with bringing people and things home.
Mhm.
Yeah. Any other thoughts of what might be going on here? My only other thought is thinking back to actually, Sue, what you were asking, kind of about the trade relationships and people and this like exchange of agricultural and meat products.
Mhm.
It helps trade if the people you're trading with actually have things to trade with.
Yeah. Oh,
Mhm.
That if the people of this area can't farm, they can't make goods, even if they're like more tradespeople where they're like spinning wool into clothing, sewing clothing, whether it's making pots and pans or clay cups, you kind of need inventory. You need to be able to have a livelihood. And I actually wonder if this is a way to support community, that by not taking their stuff, he's actually ensuring kind of that the city can continue to be, which means he will be able to return again and continue a trade partner.
well, that's
And so
the
this-
lesson that should have been learned better than it has been. But we wouldn't have had maybe the Second World War if we treated Germany differently after the First World War.
Yeah, Mary Ellen?
As I'm listening, I'm thinking, and of course processing at the same time, and I'm wondering if by leaving this community healthy, where it can survive and prosper, if Abram has enlarged his domain, because now they're indebted to him.
Oh,
And I don't know what's coming, but I'm wondering if this is foretelling or of things to come, because you are a much more effective ruler if your subjects think towards you. And if he can increase his domain by behaving like this, he then becomes an even more powerful leader. So now I don't know if I'm projecting too much into this, but he certainly has left them indebted to him.
Yes, he has. And so, that's part of why I'm questioning about like the politics at play here. Because at first it reads very benevolent. But is that the point? Because yeah, you could almost sell it as like, oh, look, your king wanted to give away your stuff. I gave it back to you. And there's the power of both persona and by public opinion. That yeah, he has, maybe even if it's not like Abram never becomes a king or like a governor or ruler. He's not, he has his nomadic tribe that he's moving around with. He doesn't get elevated quite there, but there is still a lot where there's a lot where he can still exert cultural influence, and he seems to want to be aware of this. And that it's nice if people feel indebted to you, especially if you're nomadic and you're not there all the time. It's nice when you roll into town and people are like, oh my gosh, it's Abram. Remember, he gave us all our stuff back. There is that. So Mary Ellen, 100%, I think you're onto something there.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, with 2 minutes left, is there any other thoughts? Or I know this one isn't as applicable to our own lives, but it is interesting, kind of a snapshot of at least how he's perceived.
I don't know. The only other thing is that in the back of my mind, there's always this nagging thought that Kugel brought up in his book, that, you know, there are a lot of people that really wonder if Abram ever existed.
Yeah. Yeah, he talks about that in the notes in my Bible doesn't mention that, so it's.
Yeah.
What I would point you to time and again, because that is a big question, is does this person even exist? Is I would compare it to King Arthur and whether
Yeah.
we think King Arthur exists or not, because that is a similar debate of there seems to be something, but we don't quite know what.
So what? Yeah. But it's still a good story. It's a
Oh.
magnificent story.
It's a very long
Yeah.
story too.
Yes.
Uh-huh. All right. So for next time, let's just do chapter 15. We are going to talk a lot about covenants. This is one where we've already talked a little bit about their deal. This has a lot of history in it and kind of cultural thing. We'll talk about some of the dynamics of this, because understanding this will help for other things, but there's also some weird stuff going on. And I won't promise, this will come up again and again. So just 15, if you want to do some extra reading, read up on covenants. But with that, can I pray us out?
Mhm.
All right, let's go to God. Good and gracious God, it's our scripture today wasn't as focused on your direct actions and the way you directly move in the world, but God, it's always interesting reading about the people that we have looked to for what it means to have a faithful example of how to live by your will. Sometimes we try to understand the culture that they're living in. Sometimes we're just trying to understand their emotions and the situations that they're in. But what we do know is that you continue to act, and that what you're calling us to is specific to our time and our place. If only we can understand how you interact with our culture and ask us to step up, to step out, and to be that blessing that you told Abraham that he would be. So I ask that you bless this group as always, bless their ponderings and their thoughts, bless everywhere they go, whether it is into places, meeting new people, whether it is to the familiar spots, whether it is the nomadic cycle of circle of friends. May you bless them at every point along the way. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.